This isn't going to be the perfect code base for everyone, but I really like where it is. The reason that I do is because it has Cypress tests that are end-to-end. Here we have generated features and routes. The features are only IDs. Eventually, I'm probably going to statically replace these IDs across the code base, because right now if I do a search for that, you see that it's used in one place, and I can click on pre-login admin, and that's fine there because it only points to one place. But I was running into an issue where I was trying to make this a little bit easier to use, and doing that made it hard. Backing up, I'm thinking while I'm going through this, so maybe I should wait a bit. So for concept, I guess, if I click on delete, I see app, concept, event, scene, and tag, and JavaScript, and also the TypeScript. So I don't necessarily know if I want to have that kind of auto-completion set up that way. There are a few things that I can do that make the TypeScript a little bit more clever, but I don't really want to, because clever solutions with type systems are sometimes more brittle when you try to scale them across multiple people, because they require a certain amount of knowledge about the type system and how it works and some of those intricacies. And it's not necessarily helpful to require that kind of domain knowledge. And I feel like that's one of the main things about the way that I've structured this code base. So here we have features and forms in the identities folder. The point of this folder is to represent the IDs that we're going to be using. If I do a search for any of these symbols, then I can see exactly where they're used. I like when forms have IDs because it makes it a little bit easier to reference them, and if necessary, you can add this form ID as a data attribute only in development, or you can have it as a different kind of attribute on the form element in production. This just makes it a little bit easier to reference the ways that we input information. In the identities folder as well, we have a GraphQL folder that has a set of queries. I think they're all currently right. Interesting. What are those? Yeah, actually, I don't quite remember where these come from, and so I'm gonna have to think about that. I think the CodeGen library is what does it. CodeGen GraphQL. Factor extracted GraphQL schemas for all remaining mutations and queries. So this is kind of ambiguous in general. There isn't documentation that well describes when and what this is supposed to be. The core folder is pretty standard. It has things that are meant to be imported into all of the other folders. The features folder has specifically the entity types, and generally if I were to communicate cross teams, I would want to generally use these kinds of entity types and reference specific behaviors in these feature folders, because people who aren't developers don't really mind what the folder structure is, as long as they can refer to the things that you're doing. So if we click into this assets control panel, we're requiring the enabling of the assets feature, which is referenced in the assets/IDs file. Generally, it helps to keep a relatively consistent folder structure across dimensions. The main goal here is to make it very clear what is domain knowledge, what's specific to your application, versus something that's part of the framework. And that can be kind of confusing. It depends on the type of developers you're trying to hire. Just generally, if you want people to get up to speed very quickly, you want to reduce the amount of domain knowledge that needs to be taught. There's a lot of noise in terms of finding out what people are doing with their code base and needing to distinguish, okay, why does this folder exist? If I want these features, I need to place them in these files. That's a lot to manage. Documentation ideally would be descriptive enough to make it easy for people to get onboarded with the code base. It isn't necessarily easy to, it's not necessarily straightforward, I should say. I made my own form class because I don't want to require people to know a specific structure, and forms are very important for the sites that I'm building. Generally, on a team, I might use something different, but because I want to make sure that I always understand how the forms on my sites work, and I don't really want that to be dependent on upgrading specific dependencies, I implemented it myself. It makes it a little bit easier for me to know that certain things are going to happen in specific ways, and if I want a specific type of design implemented, I know where to do it. The services folder is helpful because it points out the third-party dependencies and ways that we're approaching them. If I do a search for Redux, I have reducer, selectors, and types. And that's pretty consistent across the entity types. And I feel like those are the main things. The backend is relatively similar, or it's structured to complement the front end. Right now we're looking at the resolvers for GraphQL, and these used to be something, but I didn't really like the backend that I had for the goals that I have. I wouldn't necessarily recommend just gutting your backend every time you forget how it works. But sometimes it just is a bit more difficult to know that things are happening in the ways that you expect them to. So I have this schema.graphql file that lists the shape of the queries and mutations. I also have this schema.prisma file that describes the entity types we have available. Not all of these entity types are meant to be interacted with on the front end. So there is a bit of separation between the schema.graphql and schema.prisma file. For the most part, we have entity types that are many to many, many to, I guess, one to many. One to one as well, I believe. I don't remember exactly how this is structured. But a cool thing about the tools that we have access to now are that it wouldn't be that difficult to generate some sort of graph or some sort of visualization that makes it easy to understand what this schema file does. In terms of code generation, it's nice to have well-defined types, because then you can say, hey, generate me code that fills this contract. Also, in terms of code generation, my README file is in Swoop. This is very concise, and I've used ChatGPT. I might link a video about that. But I've used ChatGPT to extend specific elements and say, hey, can you explain what this is supposed to be? And ChatGPT is pretty good with structured language. The point is to have structured language. It's part of your documentation. Updating it is another thing and would need to be minded by the developers who are interacting with this code base. Knowing what is duplicated in multiple places. So for example, if I say in a README file, this is what this code should do, I need to make sure that I update that whenever that section of code changes. Cypress is helpful because it allows me to describe literally what each page should do. And that's the reason that I have the routes generated here. It's probably clearer if I go to the actual TS file that generates those. This solution is just okay. The reason that I implemented this is I wanted to make the admin prefix changeable per site, but doing a search for admin/all wouldn't work in that case. Nothing found. Could also do a search for /all, assuming that I have a relatively consistent folder structure. But that's also kind of difficult to find. So this is like a just okay solution. Something that I could do is add another property on all of these routes and then require a specific type. So if I said actually, I'm going to do it here. String what's that called? I forgot. Route. Our categories. Types. Route config. Prefix path. Right, navlink config. So I don't really love the name of that route. I probably want to use the navlink config map. I'm just going to copy and paste that. So if there were an error, I would know where that comes from. I would know where the error is the main thing. Because I'm looking for this type to be fulfilled. If I change this to string, for example, it wouldn't work. Shouldn't work. That should be a TypeScript error. Yeah. The reason these are const is only personal preference. I know that these aren't being exported outside of this file, and I might have a discussion if I wanted to add types to all of these. But having a mechanism at all where I can verify that they all have a roughly similar structure is the main thing. I actually do think that I want that to be more strongly typed, so I'm probably going to refactor this at some point. I don't know if I have any active storybook tests. As I implement the features on the 5 sites that I'm building, I'm going to use that to visually confirm that each component works the ways that it does, or works the ways that it should, and use Cypress to verify that the behavior is consistent with the technical direction that I want to go. So making sure the correct selectors are on the proper components, proper elements. That's basically it.